Early one East African morning, on the 24th of January 1941, two native dairy workers found a black Buick on the wrong side of the Nairobi to Ngong Road. Inside was the corpse of Jocelyn Hay, the 22nd Earl of Erroll. He had been shot, and it was clearly murder. At the time, it was a sensational colonial crime and caused controversy during wartime Britain. He was part of what came to be known as the Happy Valley set, and this could be the key to the reason behind his death. This is the unexplained murder of Lord Erroll. He was born in 1901, the eldest son of the diplomat Victor Hay, Lord Kilmarnock, and his wife Lucy. Although possessing one of Scotland's most distinguished titles, the Earls by this time had no wealth and had to develop careers to earn their living. In 1920, Hay followed his father into the diplomatic service and was posted to Berlin. After passing the Foreign Office exams, Hay was expected to pursue his career in diplomacy, but instead became infatuated with Lady Idina Sackville, divorced wife of the politician Ewan Wallace, and the wife of Charles Gordon. Lady Idina soon divorced her husband in 1923, and she and Hay were married on the 22nd of September of that year. After causing a society scandal due to their marriage, she was now twice divorced and 8 years his senior, they both decided to move to Kenya a year later, financing the move with Idina's money. Their home was a bungalow on the slopes of the Aberdare Range, which they called Slains, after the former Hay family seat of Slains Castle, which was sold by Hay's grandfather in 1916. It was located among the high-altitude farms, which other white Kenyans were able to establish at the time. These colonial expatriates were known as the Happy Valley set, who became notorious for drug use, drinking, adultery, and promiscuity, among other things. Hay soon became part of this group and accumulated a number of debts. He had inherited his father's titles in 1928, and so he became Lord Erroll, and his wife divorced him in 1930 because he was cheating her financially. He then went on to marry the divorced Edith Ramsay Hall in February. Her previous husband, Major Ramsay Hall, had invited Erroll to go on safari. Molly and Erroll went in the first car, whilst her husband followed with the luggage in the second. He realised that they were absent and went on a wild goose chase to find them. It is reported that on discovering his wife and Erroll, he horsewhipped the philanderer. After the Errolls' marriage, they lived in Osarian, a Moroccan-style house on the shores of Lake Naivasha, and his new wife soon became involved with the hedonistic lifestyle of Happy Valley. In 1938, she died of a heroin overdose. The social leader of this group was the third Lord Delamere, Hugh Cholmondeley, who walked with a limp following an attack by a lion. He was a pioneer in developing agricultural advances, in particular wheat and dairy, which nearly bankrupted him. He had been one of the first British settlers in East Africa and is credited with helping form the Happy Valley set. Lord Delamere first travelled to East Africa in 1891 for lion hunting and returned yearly to resume his pursuit. In 1894 he was mauled by a lion. As a result, he limped for the rest of his life. He is also credited for inventing the term white hunter. He quickly became well known among the European community in Kenya. There is the story of Delamere's riding his horse into the dining room of Nairobi's Norfolk Hotel and jumping over the tables. He was also known to knock golf balls onto the roof of the Muthaiga Country Club, the pink stucco gathering place for Nairobi's white elite, and then climb up to retrieve them. Within this group was a subgroup of settlers who were more interested in debauching themselves than concentrating on farming. They were called the Happy Valley Set and were centred around the town of Gilgil, between a range of mountains called the Aberdares and the Wanjiri River. Their antics led to it being said that the group was afflicted by altitude, alcohol, and adultery. The word drugs could have been added, as they were habitual users of morphine and cocaine. In 1940, Broughton arrived with his new wife Diana in Kenya. He was the heir to 35,000 prime Cheshire farmland acres, as well as several large houses. Prior to inheriting on the death of his father in 1914, he was chronically short of funds. Mess bills in the Irish Guards were well overdue, prior to his elevation to the peerage. In 1914 he was unable to join a troop ship in Portsmouth, which he later claimed was a result of sunstroke. He never saw active service and was pensioned out of the army in 1919, with a disability allowance. He suffered from severe migraine and amnesia. He also dragged his left foot and had an arthritic right hand as a result of a motoring accident in 1915. He was said to be dull and rather morose, but he had one ace card. He was rich and started to spend money on a grand scale. The first Mrs. Delves Broughton was Vera Boscawen, and the marriage was not a success, as she spent much of her time away on overseas trips, hunting big game, whilst her husband stayed at home. The last time they met was in 1938 at the marriage of their daughter Rosamond to Lord Lovat. In 1939, the wife of Lord Moyne, a Guinness heir, died, and Vera, believing she would be the next Lady Moyne, started divorce proceedings against Broughton, which he took very badly. On a visit to England in 1934, Lord Erroll joined Oswald Mosley's British Union of Fascists, and on his return to Kenya a year later, he became president of the Convention of Associations. He was elected to the Legislative Council as member for Kiambu in 1939. On the outbreak of World War II that year, he became a captain in the Kenya Regiment and accepted the post of military secretary for East Africa. In 1935, Broughton was staying with a friend, Jack Fielden, at Tadcaster, where he first met Diana Caldwell, aged 22, for the first time. She led an extraordinary social life, in which she danced in London, hunted with the Grafton Hunt in Warwickshire, and flew her own plane. Broughton felt he could do his bit in the war by running the coffee plantation in Kenya. Whilst the divorce proceedings with Vera were dragging their way through the courts, Diana and Broughton decided to go to Kenya. They went by boat to South Africa, and whilst they waited for authorization to enter Kenya, they eventually got married in the Durban Registry Office on the 5th of November 1940. On the 30th of November, Diana met Erroll whilst Broughton was away attending a Caledonian ball at the Mathega Club. By Christmas they had become lovers, and the whole Happy Valley set knew about it. Broughton received an anonymous note at his club. It stated, "You seem like a cat on hot bricks at the club last night. What about the eternal triangle? What are you going to do about it?" This note was shown to Diana. Later, a second note was sent, and it read, "Do you know your wife and Lord Erroll have been staying alone at the Cranberry's house in Nyeri together?" June Cranberry was the best friend of Diana, and her husband was a notorious sadist who is known for his appalling behaviour to African servants, even by the admittedly low standards of the white community. Broughton tried to persuade Diana to come with him on a 3-month trip to Ceylon, and hopefully she would forget Erroll. Since the beginning of January 1941, Diana had spent only 5 days in the marital home. Around this time, Broughton had summoned his 2 servants, announcing that 2 of his revolvers were missing, together with a silver cigarette case and a small amount of cash. He explained to the police that "I think access was gained to the room by means of a door on the veranda, which leads to the bedroom, and I think that may have been unlocked." A third anonymous note was deposited in his cubicle at the club. It read, "There is no fool like an old fool. What are you going to do about it?" Obviously not everyone was ecstatic about the love between Erroll and Diana. In the earlier hours of the 24th of January 1941, 2 African dairymen were walking along the Nairobi to Ngong Road. At a crossroads they came across a Buick on the wrong side of the highway. Inside it was a European in uniform. On further inspection he was found to be dead, with a bullet hole near his left ear. They called the police. Given the gravity of the situation, local Superintendent Poppy took over the case. Before going to Kenya, he had served 10 years at Scotland Yard, where he was part of the flying squad. In 1940 he was appointed Chief of Police in Kenya and head of the local CID. Suspicion immediately fell on Broughton, whose movements were highly questionable, as he had lit a bonfire that night. Among the items burnt were a pair of gym trainers, which were commonly used by his servants. Despite cancelling his proposed trip to Ceylon, he rebooked it again and wanted Diana and her friend June Cranberry to accompany him. From the beginning, the superintendent felt Broughton was the culprit. Speaking to the African servants, he learned that the Broughtons had visited Soames Farm for revolver practice. A spent cartridge that was retrieved showed the bullet used in the killing of Erroll came from Broughton's pistol, and he was immediately arrested. He needed a defence barrister, but no one from England wanted to take the risk of travelling abroad in wartime. A local barrister would have to do. In the end, Diana flew to Johannesburg and hired a top defence barrister called Harry Morris KC for £5,000. The trial started on the 26th of May 1941. The media coverage threw into sharp relief the extravagant lifestyles and social mores of the idol-rich in Africa, while Britain suffered wartime rationing and nightly raids by the German bombers. Broughton had always appeared sanguine about the affair, and on the evening of the murder, Erroll had dined with Diana and her husband before he took his lover dancing. Later, Diana and Erroll returned to the house, but he left after about 10 minutes. Getting into his Buick, he travelled up the Nairobi Road, and when he arrived at the crossroads, he was shot. Unexplained white scuff marks were found on the back seat, and the gun used was never found. The evidence against Broughton rested on the ballistics report, as the government scientists, Ernest Hamish and Maurice Fox, stated that the bullets were the same as ones fired by a .32 caliber Colt revolver. The actions of Broughton telling the police about theft just 4 days before the murder looked very suspicious. Morris rubbished the expert's evidence. The expert's description of the Colt revolver was accurate, with 6 grooves and anti-clockwise rifling. But Morris convinced the court that the murder weapon was probably a Smith & Wesson, which has 5 grooves and clockwise rifling. Morris took a terrible risk and allowed Broughton to give evidence. Many accused to condemn themselves, usually through their arrogance. Broughton survived the ordeal. In the end, he was acquitted on the 1st of July, as there was no firm evidence against him. The case officially is still unsolved. Diana assisted her husband, but after the trial accused him of being the murderer and divorced him. By chance, Janita Carberry, a neighbour of Erroll's, later claimed that Broughton confessed the murder to her soon after his acquittal. Both were now ruined socially amongst the European community, and he knew that he had no future in Kenya, and he returned to Liverpool in 1942, where he stayed at the Adelphi Hotel. A few days later he committed suicide by injecting himself with an overdose of barbiturates. Aside from the murder trial, he was heavily in debt due to his gambling addiction. There were also some questions to be answered on the theft of some pictures in which he had claimed the insurance. Diana was socially ostracized by the white community and couldn't go to any club or hotel. But she was made of tougher material. A month after the suicide of Broughton, she married Gilbert Colville, a former Grenadier Guards officer who was one of her neighbours and one of the richest men in Kenya. She was allowed to own a string of horses in Nairobi, and it was not until the early 1950s that she was being accepted again by the European community. Some years later, a story emerged which could shed light on the unsolved death of Erroll. It may or may not be true, and is an interesting theory. The new evidence suggests exactly how he carried out the murder. Broughton, who was wearing a pair of white plimsolls, had slipped into the back of Erroll's car while he was saying goodbye to Diana. As Erroll approached the crossroads, Broughton shot him. The killer was then picked up further along the road at a prearranged spot by another car, which drove him home. The driver was Dr. Athan Phillip, an ear, nose, throat and eye specialist who was a refugee from Sofia in Bulgaria. He was a neighbour of the Broughtons, and his practice wasn't going very well, so he was happy to take a generous payment for doing a simple taxi job. Whether he knew exactly why he had to be at a certain place at a certain time isn't clear, but the reason why Broughton had told Erroll to bring Diana home by 3 a.m. was so that he could put his plan into action. Lord Erroll is buried in the graveyard of St. Paul's Anglican Church in Kiambu in Kenya, next to his second wife Molly. His earldom and lordship of Hay passed to his only child Diana by his first wife Molly, while his barony of Kilmarnock passed to his brother Gilbert. After Lady Adina Sackville and Erroll divorced, she married twice more. She died in 1955. The remnants of the Happy Valley set eventually faded into history.